We are almost finished with the purchase contract. Today we are going to talk about the termination procedure and the boxes that you need to check, and then how to complete that last page with all of the information. So let's dive right in. We're going to start here on line 618, paragraph 37, termination procedure. And I'm going to read this to you because it's super important. In the event either party to this contract is entitled to deliver a termination notice to the other party pursuant to this contract, the party receiving the termination notice has an affirmative obligation to sign the termination notice, and the earnest money shall be disbursed pursuant to the terms of this contract, except as otherwise provided in the immediately preceding sentence. If either party delivers a termination notice for a reason other than is allowed under this contract to purchase real estate, then such termination notice shall state with specificity the reasons for such termination, and should further propose a distribution of the earnest money, and the receiving party shall accept or reject the proposed termination notice within the time requirements of this paragraph. In the event that both parties agree to the termination and the proposed distribution of the earnest money, then, after the earnest money is distributed as directed, this contract is terminated, and neither party shall have any continuing liability or obligation to the other party. In the event that the parties cannot agree to the termination or distribution of the earnest money, then the provisions of paragraph 25 and 26 shall govern the ultimate distribution of the earnest money and disposition of the contract. If either party submits a termination notice or refuses to sign the termination notice without right under the reasons submitted on the notice, such party shall be considered in default as described in paragraph 24. The termination notice shall be signed and returned within 5 days, or the terms of the paragraph 26 shall govern. So this refers us back to a few paragraphs we've already talked about. I'm going to flip up there really quick. So we're going to be looking at paragraphs 24, 25, and 26 for a quick review. Okay, so paragraph 24 are the remedies upon default. So if the parties do not agree on that termination, then that refers us here to the remedies upon default. Again, the defaulting party has performed something that maybe isn't within the confines or within the binding effect and the requirements and responsibilities of that party, and the non-defaulting party is the one who would be seeking remedy, okay? Then we come down to the earnest money, and again, that has to be a written agreement on the release of the earnest money agreed upon by the buyer and seller on how that's going to be dispersed. If the termination is a legal right of the buyer to perform, then the seller should be legally obligated to release that earnest money to the buyer, because it was their legal right under the terms of the contract to terminate for whatever that reason was. However, if the buyer is terminating and it is not their legal right within the contract, they just changed their mind, they want to buy a different house, whatever, then the seller could argue, and at that point, the buyer would be the defaulting party, the seller would be the non-defaulting party, and it would proceed according to what these paragraphs provide, and if the seller so chose, could go to mediation, arbitration, litigation, or the seller could seek or sue for performance of contract by the buyer. So again, that termination, some legal reasons for termination would be something like the house didn't appraise at the purchase contract, it appraised lower, and the seller refuses to adjust the purchase price down to the appraised value, but the lender will not provide a loan for that appraised value. And in this market, some people are waiving the appraisal and agreeing to bring cash to close. If that separate agreement is in place, that wouldn't be a legal reason to terminate within whatever measures were agreed upon. However, if there is no waiving of the appraisal, or the buyer agreeing to bring so much cash to closing in lieu of the appraisal value, then a low appraisal and the lack of financing then would be a valid and legal reason for termination, and the seller should return the earnest money to the buyer. We see a lot of buyers choosing to terminate based on the inspection results from the inspection report. It is in the buyer's interest, especially in lieu of the earnest money release, to provide the seller the opportunity to perform repairs. So definitely fill out that inspection response. Give the seller the opportunity to remedy whatever the repairs are. The exception would be if it was a structural defect and the licensed structural engineer has deemed the property unsafe or uninhabitable. That's a valid reason to terminate. There are all kinds of different scenarios and circumstances and situations. I'm not going to go through all of those right here, right now, as we're learning the contract. But that is a discussion to have with your coaches in your coaching sessions to learn how to navigate through different termination scenarios. Okay? We're going to move on to paragraph 38, addenda. So these are the different addenda that could be attached to your purchase contract for your buyer. Tomorrow, or the next time we are together, we are going to go through a lot of these addenda. The only ones I'm really going to talk about right now are the residential real property disclosure, the lead-based paint disclosure, the radon disclosure, and then the additional addenda. So you will want to mark these boxes, making them as an attachment to the contract. The buyer will need to be presented these disclosures, and so they've seen them, they've acknowledged them, they've signed them, and they become an attachment to the purchase contract. So when the buyer signs the purchase contract, they sign the disclosures, and the whole kit and caboodle is sent over to the listing agent. The additional addenda, a lot of times you'll see the square footage disclosure. Sometimes different agencies may have a disclosure for their agency. So that would be an addenda if it's included in their disclosure packet that they've uploaded to Maris to that property. Special agreements. Different things could be added in here. You are not an attorney, so you do not want to add verbiage unless it's at the direction of your buyer. So let your buyer know, I'm not an attorney. I am not supposed to be adding verbiage to this is a legal binding contract. And but if you direct me to add verbiage, I can. Some special agreement things that are added in, I spoke a few minutes ago about waiving the appraisal, or a buyer willing to bring $2,000 cash to the table in lieu of a discrepancy of appraisal. Or don't use that language. I am not giving that as an example for you to write in. I am saying that those are some examples that buyers have requested to be written here. You can only write in that special agreement as a request from the buyer. You are not an attorney. You do not add verbiage to a legal binding contract. So there's that discussion. Sometimes you may be related or have an interest in the purchase. In other words, the buyer could be your spouse. The buyer could be your mother. The buyer could be your company. So you would identify your name here on line 652, agent interest. You would put your name here. Now, I would bump back up to special agreements and explain that relationship, because this blank here only allows you to put your name in. It's not real long. So put whatever that relationship is up here in special agreements. If you are the buyer or it's your company, then you would need to identify yourself as a realtor and an interested party, obviously, as an Illinois licensed realtor. Buyer's initials here. Address, date should auto-populate, and we get into the blanks on the page 12. This is the signature page. So you would complete, obviously, the buyer name, address, city, state, zip. If there's another buyer, then you would add that information here. on these lines. If there's no other buyer, put N/A for buyer number 2 and just leave those blank then. You would enter in Keller Williams Marquee as a selling broker, Keller Williams Marquee's license number. That information you can find on Maris. I believe it's on our office website page. You can access that information in several places. The easiest place I think, is just go to Maris and go to office roster. You have it right there. The office address, city, state, zip, the office phone number, and then you would have your name as the designated agent, your license number, your cell phone number. If you're on a team, production under, this would be your team name or your rainmaker's name, and then your email address. On the other side is the seller information. So you may say, I don't know the seller's name. Yes, you do. Pull up the address on Realist Report or the county tax records. Look at the information on the residential real property disclosure that would have the seller's name. Write in the seller or type in the seller's name. I don't know the seller's address. Go to the tax records or the Realist Report. Look up the address where the tax bill is mailed to. That would be the seller's address. This is also how you know who would be on that seller's deed, because the tax records would be mailed. The tax records would identify the seller's names, the owner's names. That would be who is on the deed for the seller to sign. So again, seller's name, address, city, state, zip. If there's a second seller, put that information here. If there's not, put N/A or dashes or X's. Then you come down to the listing broker. Now, if it's a property on Maris, then you have that information right there on the listing at the very bottom of the listing on Maris. Fill in all of this information. If it's not all there on the listing, then go to the agent roster or office roster on Maris, look up the information and fill it in accordingly. So you'll be able to get the listing broker name, the broker license number, the address, the office phone number, the designated agent's name, of course, is identified on Maris, that agent's license number, that agent's cell phone number. You may not know if they're on a team. You could definitely ask them if they are, if they need to be identified under a production under name, and then the listing agent's email address. Contract to be accepted by seller by blank on blank. So you want to give enough time for the listing agent to receive it, for the listing agent to present it and discuss it with the seller, and then for the seller to respond and the listing agent to provide that response to you as the buyer's agent. In a hot market, you probably want to reduce the amount of time. In a slower market, you could extend it a bit to be more convenient for the listing agent and the seller. A general rule has been give 24 hours. Obviously, in a hot market, you don't want to give 24 hours if you can avoid it. Again, this is at the discretion of your buyer. So have a conversation with your buyer. Ask them when they want to have a response by. They may say, I want a response now. I would say, depending on the time of day, if you are writing and preparing this document in the morning, it's okay to put a 6 p.m. response time, so long as you deliver it in the morning. In a really super hot market, hot property, maybe you're going to put 4 hours response time. But a general rule is, if you can, allow 24 hours or something like that, at least to the next business day. If it's 9 o'clock at night, don't give them a 4-hour response time. Just use some common sense on that, and put the shoe on the other foot. If you were the list agent and you were receiving the offer at whatever time of day it is, how long would you appreciate a response time to be able to communicate with your client and get the response back to the buyer's agent? Just be courteous and conscientious of that. Buyer signs. If there's 2 buyers, both sign. Offer to purchase received by listing agent, date and signature. The listing agent would sign here. I hereby acknowledge receipt of blank. This would be the earnest money. Today, with all of the electronic transfer of funds, usually this is blank. A lot of people don't even have checks anymore. It used to be that buyer would give you a check as the buyer's agent, and you would hold that in your file and deliver it to the title company once you had an agreement. That doesn't happen as often these days. Basically, when a contract is agreed upon, then the buyer usually does deposit the earnest money at that time. So lately, this has not been completed. However, if the buyer does write a check out and hand it to you, then you do have to sign this line that you have received that earnest money check. Okay. From here below, this line 691, 692, 693, that is completed by the listing agent and the seller. So you disregard this. This is what you're going to look for when the listing agent shares it back to you. You want to know if the seller accepted, rejected, or counter offered your offer. The seller would sign here. You should know the title company, so before you send this off, you do want to fill in the title company name. Again, if the if the listing agent identified where to deposit the earnest money in the agent remarks on MLS, then you'll know that that's the title company. You can put that information here. If they didn't, remember on page 1 where you're writing down what the earnest money deposit the buyer is making and where that's going to be deposited, you would have already contacted the listing agent to ask what the title company is or where should you deposit the earnest money. So whatever's on page 1 in the earnest money deposit information, that's the same information that would go here. So if it's Maverick Title on page 1, it's Maverick Title on page 12. So, and it's fine to just put the name in there if you're not sure of the address. A lot of title companies have different locations, and maybe you're not sure which location that it's closing. So long as you have the title company name, that would be sufficient. Something a lot of folks forget on page 12, because it is a signature page, your buyers have signed here, but they do also need to initial the bottom of page 12. That is the fulfillment and the completion of the purchase contract. You made it. Go back and read through the document. Make sure you know all of those deadlines. And if you have any questions or you need some clarification, ask your coaches or find me. We can set up an appointment and go through it together. Make it a great day.